Every time I've heard Richard speak at one of these events, I've gone away with more information and, better still, more enthusiasm to continue the work. So I look forward to hearing from Richard in his new role as leader of the Scottish Labour Party.
Pauline, thanks very much indeed, and thanks again to the Morning Star for producing a paper every day or 6 days a week, and therefore providing working people with a good objective analysis of what's really going on out there, because there is no other newspaper source that provides that in the English-speaking world anyway. So I just want to place on record my thanks for that, and I have to say as well, on this occasion, I want to take the opportunity to say that I think the addition of Conrad as the Scottish correspondent has made a real difference, and I think the quality of journalism that he is producing is outshining many of the other people working in the industry that have been here for a very long time. So I think Conrad, you do a great job. I'm not sure whether there has ever been a leader of the Scottish Labour Party addressing a Morning Star conference before, so maybe this is a first time. But I do think it's important that the Scottish Labour Party stops looking so much to the right in politics and starts looking to the left in politics for working arrangements. And when Roseanne and Lynn were talking, it reminded me. Gramsci talks about intellectuals, doesn't he? And he talks about traditional intellectuals, those people who reside in ivory towers. But he also speaks about organic intellectuals, that is people who bring intellectual analysis based upon their everyday experience. And I think that both Lynn and Roseanne bring that. There was a clear intellectual analysis running through what they were saying, but it had its roots in their experience as trade union organisers. And that's what we need to have inside the labour and trade union movement. We need to get those voices heard in the wider political discussions that we're having. So last summer we launched a Scottish Labour Industrial Strategy, and language is important, and it talked about the need for radical structural change, because there is no point in simply tinkering around the edges, and there are people in this room who've written for many years about some of the fundamental and underlying weaknesses of the Scottish economy which need to be addressed. And I have to say, 20 years on almost since devolution, many of those economic problems are still outstanding and haven't been addressed, and so we need to have that more radical approach. And I have to say as well that what we do cannot simply be predicated on a Keynesian-style reflation of the old economy. We need to look at how we can build a new economy, a more democratic and diverse economy. We need, therefore, I think, to look at an industrial strategy which seeks to achieve, on the one hand, economic diversification, but on the other hand, economic democracy. How can we build up the voice of working people inside the economy? And I'll say a couple of things about that shortly. But when I speak about diversification, I want to just again highlight, because the SNP talk a lot about how diverse our economy is, but even their own figures show that 15 businesses in Scotland account for nearly half, 48%, of all business research and development. And I have to say most of them are in the defence sector. 70 businesses based in Scotland account for 50% of all export. So there is a huge concentration of power and responsibility, I suppose, as well, on just a few companies. And so if we're going to see economic transformation and economic change in the interests of the wider needs of working people in Scotland, then we need to see a completely new approach, which doesn't simply look either to foreign direct investment as the route for economic development, which sees the need for ways in which we can build the economy from the bottom up. So I'm pleased that in the Labour Party now we are talking about cooperative development, we are talking about public ownership, and we are talking about worker ownership as part of that. One of the things that the strategy speaks about is the role of pension funds, which is something I've spoken at the Morning Star conferences down the years about, because there is an opportunity when you look, for example, here we are in Glasgow, the Strathclyde Local Government Pension Scheme is worth about £15 billion in value, and most of that is invested in derivatives, stocks and shares, often overseas stocks and shares, and yet we've got a major crisis in housing in the west of Scotland. So why couldn't we put together those high value pension funds with the shortage of housing and invest, because housing provides a regular income stream for pension fund holders. So we need to look at how we can make primary investment into our social and economic base as part of our approach. And some of the things that we speak about, I would say, are quite unashamedly radical. And the people in this room know that the whole purpose of this movement was never simply to get merely a better deal for working people. It was always to change society to its very economic foundations. And I think along the way sometimes we've lost sight of that, but we need to get back to it, because our vision has always been an economy working for the people. And so when we talk about automation, it's about on whose terms automation will be introduced and whose interests will it serve. And that's why democracy in the economy is absolutely critical. It's also why we also need to get back to talking the language of full employment. And it looks like a different form of full employment that we saw in the post-war era, because famously after the Second World War, lots of women who were in work were put back into the home. So we're looking at a different model of full employment based upon male and female participation, but as Roseanne has just spoken about, that's got to be based on a vision of a very different work-life balance. And again, I'll say a couple of things about that shortly. One of the other things which I've been saying, which I just think it's important to reiterate, is a reminder to people that the party I lead is not a party of capital, it's a party of labour. And sometimes that's been a bit blurred in the past as well. So we need to speak up about what I view to be a decade of complacency under the SNP, where they think that the economy is working well, that it's diverse, that we've got record levels of employment and record levels of low unemployment, when actually, if you look at the real level of unemployment, it's twice the officially recorded figure. And if you look at the kind of jobs that are being created, they are not the kind of jobs that we would want to see, because they are founded on precarious work. And we know that the experience of young people, especially in the labour market, is an experience of agency working, of 0 hours contracts, of fixed term contracts. And whilst it's true that the number of people on 0 hours contracts in Scotland has dropped in the last 12 months or so, there are still 20% more people on 0 hours contracts today than there were 3 years ago. So the trend may have slowed, but the trend is still on the up. And we also have an experience in industries like construction, where once bogus self-employment through the tax system is tackled, the very next day a way around it is concocted by the industry in the form of umbrella companies and the use of agency labour. And the real scandal is firstly that this is going on in many public procurement contracts paid for by taxpayers' money. The other real scandal is that we've got a First Minister that doesn't think it exists as a problem and actually believes it's a choice. Not a choice that the bosses are making, which is actually what's going on. She thinks it's a choice that working people are making to go into these precarious forms of employment. So we've got an SNP government, a Scottish government, which spends £11 billion of public procurement each year. And so what we've been arguing forcefully, what we've been demanding, is that no procurement contract should be awarded to companies which are exploiting workers, which are not paying the living wage, which are blocking employment and trade union rights. And again, Unite have had a real battle on many of these contracts, Dumfries Hospital being a good example, where the trade union simply isn't being allowed access to recruit and organise on these sites that are paid for by us. So we need to see a radical and fundamental change in the way these contracts are awarded. And of course, most importantly of all, we should have a clear line that there will be no contracts awarded to any of those companies involved in the blacklisting scandal, which is the complete decapitation of the lay leadership of an entire industry for an entire generation. And this went on for years. And Ian Davis is here, and the Scottish Affairs Select Committee did a great deal of work in shining a light on that. But we are still at a point where companies have not fully compensated workers, not just for the loss of earnings, but for the complete change in the direction of their lives as a result of, in many cases, unbeknownst to them, being blacklisted. We hear as well from the SNP in debates that we have about whether there's an industrial strategy or not, claims that there is one. And they say that look at what happened with the Scottish Steel Task Force, with the plants at Clyde Bridge and DL being saved as a result of Fergus Ewing chairing a working group, which actually I was a member of when I worked at the GMB, which saved those plants, and that was a thoroughly good thing. They also cite the example of the aluminium smelter in Lochaber and the Ferguson Marine on the lower reaches of the Clyde as examples of their intervention in the industrial base, the economy, where they have saved jobs and turned things around. And no doubt that they will say in the future that their intervention at BIFAB provides another illustration where they have taken out a public sector stake. They will cite that as an example of a positive intervention. And of itself, it is a positive intervention. But defensive rescues do not constitute an industrial strategy. And there needs to be a forward planning. There needs to be forward planning in the economy and an understanding that trade unions should not be there simply to defend their members' interests. They should be there to promote their members' interests in a way which looks ahead to the future. And we are increasingly witnessing more and more examples of people being asked to pay the price of a failing economy, which, for example, last year, and we speak about the public sector pay cap being lifted, and people are contemplating 3% pay rises and all of that, and being told that this is a great advance, when we know that real wages have been frozen for a decade, and we know that last year dividend payments went up by over 10% to a record £94.4 billion was shelled out in dividend payments in the UK last year. Which was a rise of 10.5%, and the year before they went up 11%. Well, I don't know anybody, I don't think even the Scottish Prison Officers Association have had an 11% pay rise followed by a 10.4% pay rise. So we should be getting these figures out so people understand where the wealth of the country is going. So, and at the same time as people's earnings are being cut, of course the provision of public services is being cut as well, and so I would argue the social wage is being attacked as well. I just want to finish, Pauline, by saying a couple of things. I mean, when automation has been mentioned, and I think that might be something that we really ought to have a more thoroughgoing discussion about, because I think there are some interesting ideas and some interesting challenges for us that arise from it. You know, if you go and look at the old trade union banners, out of darkness into light, shorter hours and longer life, the cause of labour is the hope of the world. These are ideas which have got as much relevance today as they had when they were coined. And so, because of that, I do think it's absolutely right that we start to consider how we can get towards a managed reduction in working time. I mean, trade unions were not often established simply to fight for the weekly wage. They were often established to fight for the 8-hour day, or for 6-day working, not 7-day working. So working time is a hugely important thing to people, and if you go down to the BAE Systems yard on the Clyde here, it's interesting that one of the incentives in the yard to encourage people to meet production targets, hit productivity targets, and to keep their workshop clean, which is all part of that, the incentive for them to do that is not a bonus in their pay packet. The incentive for them to do that is to get a Friday off. Instead of working a half day on the Friday, they get a Friday off. So the unit of currency to incentivise working people in this city on the Clyde is working time. And I remember that when the Confed fought for the 35-hour week, there were lots of siren voices saying, yeah, the reason why the unions are fighting for a 35-hour week is so they can work extra overtime, get additional payments and boost their pay packet. But actually, if you look, again in this city where there are examples of workplaces that went down to at least a 37.5-hour week or are working shorter time on a Friday, there are very few examples of people that work overtime. Most people want the extra weekend time. And so I think this is an idea, comrades, which is popular. And so we should champion it. It's part of our roots, it's where we came from, and we need to be arguing for it, which is again why I've said, in the wake of Brexit, we have an opportunity to look at the Working Time Directive, where in the UK, since it came in 1996, I think, there has been a UK opt-out, and it allows for workers to work beyond the 48 hours, either through, I have to say, through collective negotiation or through individual opt-out. These arrangements are in place. And you know, when you look at the table of industries where the longest hours are worked, the one at the top is agriculture and fishing, and where 40% of all workers in Scotland, that's 12,500 workers, work beyond 48 hours. And the second highest is construction, where nearly 25% of all workers work beyond the 48-hour week. And which industries have got the worst health and safety record? In which industries are there the most fatalities at work? It's agriculture, fishing and construction. So there is, I think, a compelling case for a managed reduction in working time with no loss of earnings, and it's about time we came out of the long hours, low wage culture, which is what underpins that UK opt-out of working time. One of the ideas that we are keen to promote is this idea that as we have a Land Reform Act, why don't we have an Industrial Reform Act, so that there is a statutory preferential right for working people. If the plant that they work in is facing closure or takeover, as Two Sisters is, as Pinneys is, why shouldn't those working people be given the opportunity to at least consider whether they want to buy that enterprise on the basis that why shouldn't those people who create the wealth own the wealth they create? Again, it's an old Labour socialist idea, but I think it's an idea which resonates with people because it's a good example of where we could see a redistribution of power in the economy. Because the power over the future of those plants and the jobs that go with them would not rest in the hand of absentee directors. Under that change, it would rest in the hands of the workforce. Now, as I say, they may choose not to exercise that right if it existed, but at least they would have that choice. And that makes, in my view, that makes a big difference. So, the Labour Party is committed to tackling the underlying economic problems we face. We are committed to public ownership and worker ownership. Part of the agenda for economic democracy has got to be about making sure women's voices are heard in the economy, because all too often they are not. And that's not just about how do we break through glass ceilings, it's about a fundamental change to the way the economy works, and I think we need to look inside our own movement as well to see what we can do to make sure women's voices are leading the debate on the kind of economy we want. And I have to say that if they were and if they had been, we might have made a bit more progress in the last 100 years on getting shorter hours and longer life than in the stewardship of men we've been able to secure. So we are a party which I think is getting back to our traditions. We are a party which is starting to understand once again the importance of principles in politics, the importance of conviction in politics, the importance of understanding who we are, being distinctive again, and understanding that there is a right and left in politics, and the Labour Party should be firmly on the left of politics. And I think that we are beginning to rediscover who we are. I think we are beginning to reforge the alliance with the trade union movement, which again in times past some people have decried. And I think an industrial strategy represents a good example of the way in which we can bring the strands of the movement together, the intellectual strands, the trade union strands, the Labour Party strands, the broader socialist strands together, to work together to make a real change and make a real difference for working people in Scotland. So thank you very much indeed.